A man is given one simple choice: stop asking questions or die. He chooses the questions, not because he wants to be remembered, but because he believes a life without them isn't worth living. What kind of question is powerful enough to kill a man and echo for 2,400 years? Before we descend into the final days of Socrates, take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from or what you do for a living. Socrates believed every life had something worth examining. Let's see who's here today. The city that raised Socrates did not begin as his enemy. It began as his teacher. Athens in the 5th century BCE was a living argument. From dawn until dusk, voices collided in narrow streets and open squares, carrying opinions about war, virtue, beauty, money, and the gods themselves. The city smelled of olive oil, sweat, incense, and ambition. Stonecutters chipped marble into ideals. Sailors dragged news from the edges of the known world into crowded taverns. Politicians rehearsed speeches not behind closed doors, but in full view of anyone who cared to listen. This was not a quiet place to be born. And Socrates was not born quietly. He entered the world around 469 BCE in a modest household far removed from the marble glow of temples. His father, Socrates, was a stonemason, a man who shaped raw rock into something useful, perhaps even beautiful, but never permanent. His mother, Phaenarete, was a midwife. She did not create life, but she helped bring it into the light. Years later, Socrates would describe his own work in the same terms. He did not give people ideas, he helped them give birth to their own. Athens taught him that metaphor long before he ever spoke it aloud. As a boy, Socrates grew up beneath the shadow of the Acropolis, where the city worshipped not only its gods, but itself. Victory over Persia had transformed Athens into something unprecedented. A democracy confident enough to believe it could argue its way to truth. Citizens debated laws in the assembly. Philosophers debated reality in gymnasiums. Poets debated morality on the stage. To speak well was to wield power. To persuade was to rule without a crown. Yet, even in this proud openness, there was a quiet rule everyone understood. Speech was celebrated only when it reinforced the city's image of itself. Young Socrates listened. He listened to generals boast of honor, then watched soldiers limp home missing limbs. He listened to politicians praise justice, then saw verdicts sway with applause. He listened to poets speak of wisdom, then falter when asked what their verses truly meant. Something did not align. The city spoke beautifully, but rarely paused to ask whether its words were true. Most boys trained their bodies for war or their voices for influence. Socrates did neither. He was stocky, broad-nosed, awkward by Athenian standards, and famously indifferent to appearance. While others polished rhetoric, he polished questions. He learned early that certainty was often loud and fragile. Athens rewarded confidence, not doubt. But Socrates noticed something unsettling. The more confident a man sounded, the less he seemed to understand the foundations of his own beliefs. This realization did not arrive like a revelation. It crept in slowly, through conversations that ended in silence instead of agreement, through debates where no one won, but something quietly collapsed. As Athens expanded its power, it expanded its fear. Empire breeds insecurity as much as pride. Maintaining dominance required unity, and unity required shared assumptions about the gods, about virtue, about what kind of people Athenians were. Questioning those assumptions was tolerated in art, even admired in theory, but dangerous in practice. Still, the city believed itself immune. Athens told itself that it loved free speech more than any place on earth, and for a time, that was true. Socrates served as a hoplite, a heavy infantryman, in brutal campaigns that tested that belief. He fought at Potidaea, Delium, Amphipolis, battles where chaos erased philosophy and survival stripped men down to instinct. Witnesses later recalled his calm under fire, his refusal to abandon wounded comrades, his endurance in hunger and cold. These were not the traits of a man detached from reality. They were the traits of someone deeply present within it. War showed him something else as well. Orders came from men who spoke confidently of strategy, yet led others to slaughter. Courage was praised, but rarely examined. Obedience was honored, but seldom questioned. The gap between words and consequences widened, and Socrates could no longer ignore it. When the war ended and he returned to the city, Athens was louder than ever. Sophists, professional teachers of rhetoric, promised success through persuasion. For a fee, they could teach anyone to win an argument, regardless of truth. Athens adored them. They were useful. They produced results. Socrates did not charge money. He did not promise victory. He promised something far more unsettling: uncertainty. He began where Athenians gathered, in the agora, the beating heart of the city. He approached craftsmen, politicians, priests, poets. He asked them simple questions. What is justice? What is courage? What is piety? At first, the answers flowed easily. Athens was full of definitions. But Socrates did not stop there. He asked what followed from those answers, and then what followed from that. Conversations that began with confidence ended with discomfort. Men who had been applauded for their wisdom found themselves unable to explain the meaning of their own words. Socrates never raised his voice. He never mocked. He only followed the logic wherever it led. And logic, more often than not, led to contradiction. This was the moment Athens began to feel uneasy. At first, Socrates was entertaining, a curiosity, a harmless gadfly buzzing around respected men. But Athens was a city that lived on reputation. Public humiliation, even unintentional, was not easily forgiven. Each exposed contradiction chipped away at authority. Each unanswered question lingered long after the crowd dispersed. What troubled people most was not that Socrates challenged ideas. It was that he did so without offering replacements. He dismantled certainty and walked away, leaving silence behind. In a culture addicted to answers, silence felt like sabotage. Yet young Athenians were drawn to him. They watched powerful men unravel under gentle questioning. They learned that status did not equal wisdom. And they laughed, not cruelly, but knowingly. Laughter, in a fragile political climate, is dangerous. It signals that fear has shifted sides. Athens had been built on the belief that its system produced virtue. If that belief collapsed, everything else followed. Socrates never attacked democracy directly. He didn't need to. He simply asked what kind of knowledge was required to govern well, and whether anyone truly possessed it. The city that once prided itself on fearless inquiry began to flinch. Still, no charges were brought. Not yet. Athens told itself that it was strong enough to withstand one irritating philosopher. After all, Socrates claimed to know nothing. How much damage could ignorance do? But ignorance, when exposed, has a way of turning dangerous. As the city moved toward darker years, toward defeat, toward political instability, toward fear of internal enemies, Socrates' presence took on a new meaning. His questions no longer sounded playful. They sounded accusatory. And Athens, for all its love of speech, had never learned how to listen to doubt without feeling threatened by it. The city had raised Socrates to speak. Now it was beginning to wonder whether it should have, and beneath the noise of debate and the marble certainty of temples, a quiet realization was forming, one that would change everything. Some questions do not seek answers, they seek honesty. And honesty, in the wrong moment, can be fatal. He never announced himself as a teacher. That was the first mistake Athens made in underestimating him. Socrates did not stand on a platform or gather students in a formal school. He did not claim lineage from earlier thinkers, nor did he present a system neatly arranged for memorization. He appeared instead in motion, walking beside men on the way to appointments, lingering near workshops as craftsmen labored, sitting beneath colonnades where young aristocrats rehearsed speeches they hoped would carry them into power. His classroom was wherever certainty felt most comfortable. Athens was accustomed to men who proclaimed wisdom. The city rewarded them generously. Sophists arrived from distant cities with polished arguments and promised mastery over words. For the right price, they could teach a young man how to win any debate, how to bend juries, how to make the weaker argument appear stronger. In a democracy built on persuasion, this skill was invaluable. Socrates offered none of that. He insisted, again and again, that he knew nothing, not as false modesty, but as a statement of method. Knowledge, he believed, began with the admission of ignorance. This alone made him suspicious. In Athens, confidence was currency. To refuse it was to quietly reject the rules of exchange. When Socrates asked questions, they seemed almost naive at first. What is courage? What is justice? What makes a man good? His tone was unassuming, even deferential. He positioned himself not above his interlocutor, but beneath him, as someone genuinely eager to learn. The trap was invisible because it did not feel like one. The conversation would unfold gently. A definition would be offered, smooth, familiar, socially approved. Socrates would nod. Then he would ask whether that definition applied in every case. If courage was endurance, was a reckless man courageous? If justice was obedience to law, what of unjust laws? Each question followed naturally from the last, impossible to dismiss without retreating into vagueness. Slowly, the ground shifted. What made Socrates unbearable was not that he refuted people. It was that he let them refute themselves. He never declared a conclusion. He simply exposed tension between what people believed and what they said, between what they admired and what they practiced. By the end, his conversation partner often stood surrounded by the wreckage of his own certainty, unsure how it had happened. This was the elenchus, the method of refutation that would later define Socratic inquiry. But in the moment, it felt less like philosophy and more like being gently unmasked in public. Socrates did not celebrate these moments. He did not gloat. He often expressed genuine puzzlement, as if the collapse of the argument surprised him as much as anyone. That puzzled people even more. If he wasn't trying to win, then what was he doing? The answer unsettled them. He was trying to understand. Athens was not prepared for a man who valued understanding over influence. Influence could be managed. Understanding could not. As his reputation grew, so did the crowd around him. Young men, sons of generals, politicians, wealthy merchants, began following him, not because he offered answers, but because he offered permission to doubt. In a city where ambition was inherited, doubt felt like freedom. Watching powerful men falter under questioning was intoxicating. It suggested that status could be challenged not with violence, but with thought. To the youth, Socrates was electrifying. To their elders, he was corrosive. The problem was not merely that Socrates exposed ignorance, it was whose ignorance he exposed. Generals who had led men into battle, politicians who shaped law, priests who spoke for the gods. When these figures failed to define the virtues they publicly championed, the implications were terrifying. If they did not know what justice was, why should anyone obey them? If they could not explain piety, why trust them to interpret divine will? Socrates never answered these questions, but by asking them, he made obedience feel optional. This was where the denial of wisdom became dangerous. Had Socrates claimed superior knowledge, he could have been dismissed as arrogant or challenged directly. But he insisted that he was merely searching, merely testing ideas in good faith. That made him harder to attack. To condemn him was to condemn inquiry itself, a value Athens claimed to cherish. And yet, something about him felt subversive. He refused to write. Words once written could not defend themselves. They could be misread, misunderstood, stripped of context. Conversation, by contrast, lived and breathed. It adapted. It resisted being frozen into doctrine. Socrates believed truth emerged through struggle, not transmission. This made him impossible to quote accurately, and impossible to control. Athens thrived on spectacle. Trials were public. Speeches were performances. Reputation was forged in crowds. Socrates undermined spectacle by refusing to perform. He did not dress like a philosopher. He did not flatter his audience. He did not soften his questions to preserve harmony. He pursued clarity, even when it led to discomfort. The more people tried to categorize him, the more he slipped away. Was he a philosopher? He claimed not to be wise. Was he a sophist? He took no money. Was he a political agitator? He held no office and proposed no reforms. He existed outside familiar roles, and that made him threatening. Rumors followed. He was accused of trickery, of humiliating men for sport, of filling young heads with arrogance. Some said he enjoyed destruction for its own sake. Others whispered that he pretended ignorance as a strategy, masking a deeper agenda. Socrates heard these rumors. He did not deny them. He simply continued asking questions. What his critics failed to grasp was that Socrates was deeply serious about the soul, about virtue, about the consequences of living unexamined lives. He believed that ignorance was not merely an intellectual flaw, but a moral one. To act without understanding was to risk injustice, and injustice once done could not be undone. In his view, the greatest danger was not ignorance itself, but the illusion of knowledge. A man who knows he does not know is open to learning. A man who believes he knows when he does not is closed, rigid, dangerous. Athens, proud of its wisdom, was full of such men. The city began to sense this accusation beneath every question. Each conversation Socrates conducted left a faint residue: unease, irritation, self-doubt. These feelings accumulated. They followed men home. They lingered in assemblies. They infected political debate. When confidence cracked, resentment filled the space, and resentment seeks a target. Socrates had not set out to challenge Athens. He believed he was serving it, acting as a kind of moral instrument, testing the strength of its beliefs. But instruments that reveal flaws are rarely appreciated by those being measured. By refusing to be wise, Socrates had made wisdom itself suspect, and in a city built on the belief that it was the wisest of all, that suspicion would not go unanswered. As the years passed, admiration quietly transformed into hostility. Laughter turned sharper, Conversations grew tense. Men began avoiding him, not because they had nothing to say, but because they feared what they might discover. Athens had tolerated many kinds of speech, but speech that exposed the emptiness beneath authority was something else entirely. The man who claimed to know nothing had begun to teach the city something it did not want to learn. That ignorance, once revealed, does not disappear. It demands reckoning. The message arrived from Delphi like a stone dropped into still water. It was meant to be an honor. It became a disturbance that never settled. The oracle of Apollo at Delphi was not a philosopher. She did not argue or explain. She pronounced. Her words were believed to pass through the god himself, shaped by divine will rather than human reasoning. Cities paused wars over her prophecies. Kings altered laws. Generations measured themselves against her declarations. In a world where certainty was rare, Delphi offered something that felt final. So when Chaerephon, a devoted friend of Socrates, impulsive and fiercely loyal, stood before the oracle and asked whether any man was wiser than Socrates, he likely expected a polite evasion, or perhaps a flattering but vague reply. What he received instead was absolute. No one was wiser. The words travelled back to Athens faster than reason could follow them. In a city obsessed with reputation, such a declaration was explosive. To be named the wisest man alive by Apollo himself was not merely praise. It was a challenge to every authority, every teacher, every statesman who claimed insight into virtue and governance. Socrates did not celebrate. According to those who later recorded his words, he was disturbed. Genuinely, deeply disturbed. He did not believe the oracle could lie. Apollo did not deceive. And yet, Socrates knew himself well enough to know that he possessed no special knowledge. The riddle was intolerable. Either the god was wrong, or wisdom meant something radically different from what Athens believed. Socrates chose to investigate the god. This decision would shape the rest of his life. If the oracle was correct, then the wisdom of Socrates must lie not in knowledge, but in something else. And if it was not correct, then exposing that falsehood would be a service to truth. Either way, Socrates felt compelled, not by ambition, but by obligation. He believed the god had given him a task, and ignoring it would be impious. So he began a systematic search for wisdom, not among farmers or labourers, but among those most celebrated for their intellect. Politicians first, men who spoke confidently in the assembly, shaping laws and guiding the city. Socrates approached them with the same gentle questions. What is justice? What makes a law good? What qualifies a man to lead? Their answers were impressive, at first, but under examination, they dissolved into slogans and contradictions. These men knew how to persuade crowds, but not how to define the principles they defended. Socrates left each conversation with the same unsettling conclusion. These men believed they were wise, but were not. Next came the poets. Athens revered its poets. Their verses were memorized by children, quoted in public life, treated as moral instruction. If anyone understood virtue, surely it was they. But when Socrates asked them to explain the meaning behind their most celebrated lines, something strange happened. They could not. Their work was inspired, not understood. The beauty was real, but the knowledge was not. The poets, Socrates realized, created truth-like things without possessing truth itself. Finally, he turned to the craftsmen. Unlike politicians and poets, craftsmen knew their limits. A shoemaker did not claim to know politics. A carpenter did not speak for the gods. And in their craft, they possessed genuine expertise. But here too, Socrates noticed a pattern. Because they were skilled in one domain, they assumed competence in others. Mastery in making things became confidence in matters of virtue and justice. The pattern was unmistakable. Those who knew something often believed they knew everything. Those who knew nothing sometimes believed the same. And Socrates saw, with growing clarity, what the oracle meant. If he was wiser than other men, it was not because he possessed superior knowledge. It was because he did not mistake belief for understanding. He recognized the limits of his own mind and refused to hide from them. His wisdom was a form of humility, though not the gentle kind that flatters others. It was a relentless honesty that stripped away comforting illusions. This realization did not bring him peace. It brought him purpose. From that moment on, Socrates understood his role in Athens differently. He was not merely a questioner by temperament, he was an instrument of the god. A test sent to expose false wisdom wherever it appeared. This conviction hardened him against resentment and ridicule. When men grew angry, he did not retreat. Anger, he believed, was often the first sign that a cherished illusion had been touched. But Athens did not hear humility in the oracle's message. It heard provocation. If no one was wiser than Socrates, what did that imply about the city's leaders? About its teachers? About the institutions that claimed authority? The oracle's riddle destabilized the hierarchy of respect, and Socrates, by acting on it, kept that instability alive. Worse still, he spoke openly about his divine mission. He did not claim to receive visions or prophecies, but he did speak of a daimonion, a spiritual sign, an inner voice that warned him away from certain actions. It never told him what to do, only what not to do. To Socrates, this was another form of restraint, another reminder of human limitation. To others, it sounded dangerously close to impiety. Private spiritual guidance had no place in a city that regulated its gods carefully. Athens worshipped the gods publicly, collectively, predictably. Socrates' relationship with the divine was personal and unsettlingly intimate. As his investigations continued, resentment grew sharper. Politicians accused him of undermining respect for authority. Poets resented being unmasked as vessels rather than sources of wisdom. Craftsmen bristled at the suggestion that expertise had boundaries. Each group felt exposed, and exposure, once felt, rarely fades. Yet Socrates persisted. He believed that unexamined lives were not merely incomplete, but actively harmful. Men who believed they were wise governed carelessly. Citizens who assumed virtue without reflection acted unjustly. In this sense, his questioning was not destructive, it was preventative. Better discomfort now than catastrophe later. Athens did not see it that way. The oracle's pronouncement had turned Socrates into a living contradiction. He was honored and resented, admired and feared. He embodied a wisdom that refused to look like wisdom, and that made him impossible to celebrate without also questioning everything else. Quietly, the city began to reinterpret the oracle's words. Perhaps Socrates was not wise, but clever. Perhaps the god's message had been misunderstood, or worse, manipulated. Perhaps Socrates himself had twisted divine authority to justify insolence. The riddle that was meant to elevate inquiry had instead magnified suspicion. And suspicion, once planted, seeks confirmation. Every awkward silence, every embarrassed official, every laughing youth became evidence. The narrative began to shift. Socrates was no longer a man fulfilling a divine task. He was a man hiding behind one. The oracle had given Athens a mirror. Socrates refused to let the city look away. And in doing so, he crossed an invisible line, because a city can tolerate doubt. It can even admire it, but when doubt wears the voice of a god, it becomes something far more dangerous. They gathered around him without being asked. That was the part no one could control. Socrates did not recruit followers. He did not advertise his presence or promise transformation. And yet, wherever he paused long enough for a conversation to deepen, young men appeared. Some leaned against pillars, others sat cross-legged in the dust, pretending indifference while listening intently. They had heard the stories of generals faltering, of politicians unraveling, of poets falling silent. Curiosity drew them in. Recognition kept them there. These were not the forgotten sons of Athens. They were the heirs. Alcibiades, brilliant and reckless, whose beauty and ambition unsettled everyone who encountered him. Critias, sharp-minded, disciplined, impatient with moral ambiguity. Charmides, earnest and searching. Young men destined for power. Watching a man with none of it command a room without effort. To them, Socrates was not merely a philosopher. He was proof that authority could be questioned without permission. Athens had always worried about its youth. Democracy depended on their loyalty, their reverence for tradition, their willingness to inherit assumptions without dismantling them. Education was not merely about knowledge, it was about continuity. The city taught its sons what to admire, what to fear, what not to question too deeply. Socrates disrupted that transmission. He never told the young what to believe. That was the genius of it. Instead, he taught them how to ask. And once learned, that skill could not be confined. It followed them into homes, into assemblies, into private conversations with fathers and mentors. The questions spread, reminding people that many beliefs survived only because no one pressed them. At first, the laughter seemed harmless. Young men would recount conversations, reenacting the moment when an esteemed figure realized he could not explain his own certainty. There was no cruelty in it, only surprise. But surprise, when repeated, becomes embarrassment. And embarrassment, when public, becomes anger. Parents noticed changes. Their sons were still respectful, still ambitious. But something had shifted. They no longer accepted instructions without explanation. They asked why a law was just, not merely whether it was legal. They questioned the moral authority of those who had never questioned themselves. The old language of tradition began to feel thin. No one could point to a doctrine Socrates was teaching. There were no heretical claims, no alternative gods being introduced, and yet something felt wrong. A kind of corrosion was taking place, invisible but unmistakable. This is how the word corruption entered the conversation. Not corruption in the sense of bribery or vice, but something subtler. Erosion. The weakening of inherited values. The unsettling sense that youth were learning to admire cleverness over obedience, inquiry over loyalty, that they were being trained not for harmony, but for interrogation. Socrates denied the charge whenever it surfaced. How could he corrupt the youth, he asked, when he charged no money, offered no curriculum, imposed no conclusions? If influence alone was corruption, then every admired figure in Athens was guilty. But his denial missed the deeper fear. He did not corrupt the youth by teaching them what to think. He corrupted them by showing them that they could think. Athens had tolerated radical thought before. Its plays challenged the gods. Its historians questioned heroism. But these challenges occurred within accepted forms, on stages, in texts, under the veil of art. Socrates operated in real time, in real conversations, without distance or disclaimer. His influence was immediate, unpredictable, contagious, and worse, it was visible. Men began avoiding the agora when they heard his voice. Others crossed the street rather than risk conversation. Those who could not avoid him prepared defenses, rhetorical shields meant to ward off embarrassment. The presence of young listeners made everything sharper. To falter in front of peers was one thing. To falter in front of one's own sons was another. Resentment hardened. Some accused Socrates of arrogance disguised as humility. Others claimed he deliberately targeted the powerful for sport, enjoying their discomfort. The fact that he never defended himself in the expected ways only fueled suspicion. He seemed immune to reputation, indifferent to approval. That indifference looked, to some, like contempt. And then there were his associations. Several of the young men most devoted to Socrates would later play infamous roles in Athenian history. Alcibiades would betray the city, defecting to its enemies with breathtaking audacity. Critias would become one of the 30 tyrants, ruling Athens through terror during its darkest hour. Though these events lay in the future, their shadows stretched backward. Memory has a way of rearranging cause and effect. When Athens later searched for the roots of its trauma, it looked to influence. Who had shaped these men? Who had taught them to question loyalty, to distrust institutions, to believe themselves cleverer than the law? The answers began to circle one name. Socrates could not control who listened to him, nor what they later became. He had never instructed Alcibiades to betray Athens, nor Critias to rule cruelly. But nuance rarely survives political fear. Influence, once associated with disaster, becomes guilt by proximity. Still, Socrates refused to retreat. He believed that moral responsibility could not be outsourced to authority, that obedience without understanding was not virtue, but habit. And habits, when unexamined, could justify atrocity as easily as tradition. If questioning produced discomfort, so be it. Comfort, he believed, was a poor measure of truth. Athens began to feel watched. Every conversation carried the risk of exposure. Every claim to knowledge felt provisional. This atmosphere did not feel like enlightenment. It felt like instability. The city had emerged from war bruised and uncertain. It did not want mirrors. It wanted reassurance. And Socrates would not provide it. What made the situation unbearable was that he could not be silenced without contradicting everything Athens claimed to stand for. Free speech was its pride. Open inquiry its boast. To punish a man for asking questions would be to admit fragility. But allowing him to continue felt worse. So the city did what it often does when faced with an uncomfortable truth. It reframed the problem. Socrates was no longer a citizen engaging in dialogue. He was a corrupter, undermining the future. Not a seeker of truth, but a destabilizer. Not a man asking questions, but a man planting doubt. Once this narrative took hold, every laugh from the youth sounded like mockery. Every silence from an elder felt like defeat. The city began to imagine itself under siege, by words instead of weapons. And words, as Athens knew better than anyone, could topple empires. The irony was cruel. Socrates believed he was strengthening the city by forcing it to confront itself. Athens began to believe he was dissolving it from within. Between those two beliefs, reconciliation was impossible. Because a city can forgive rebellion. It can even survive defeat. But it cannot easily forgive the man who taught its children to ask whether it deserved obedience at all. Athens did not fall all at once. It cracked. The war with Sparta had stretched for nearly 3 decades, draining not just lives and resources, but confidence. What began as a contest of power ended as a slow unraveling of identity. The city that once believed itself favored by the gods now watched its fleet burn, its walls crumble, its empire dissolve. Victory had taught Athens pride. Defeat taught it fear. And fear changes the way a city listens. The streets still echoed with debate, but the tone had shifted. Where arguments once felt playful, even theatrical, they now carried an edge. Words were weighed not for insight, but for threat. The assembly no longer asked what was best, but what was safest. Democracy, battered and humiliated, grew suspicious of anything it could not control. This was the Athens that emerged from the Peloponnesian War, and it was an Athens that no longer had patience for men like Socrates. Defeat demanded explanations. Explanations demanded culprits. Some blamed poor strategy. Others blamed treachery. Many blamed moral decay. The idea took hold that Athens had fallen not merely because of Sparta's strength, but because of its own softness, its excess of speech, its tolerance of irreverence, its willingness to question tradition. If the gods had withdrawn their favor, surely it was because the city had allowed itself to drift too far from reverence. In moments like these, memory sharpens selectively. The years of Socrates' questioning, once seen as irritating but tolerable, began to feel ominous in retrospect. Had he weakened respect for authority? Had his influence encouraged skepticism toward law and custom? Had the city, in its pride, allowed corrosive ideas to fester unchecked? The questions Socrates asked now returned to haunt him. Athens oscillated violently between political extremes. After defeat, democracy collapsed. In its place rose the 30 tyrants, a brutal oligarchy installed with Spartan support. They ruled through intimidation, executions, and exile. The city learned what unquestioned authority looked like, and it was horrifying. Socrates lived through this terror. He did not flee. He did not collaborate. When ordered by the 30 to participate in an unjust arrest, he refused. Quietly, without drama, without appeal to an audience. It was a dangerous act, one that could have cost him his life. But tyranny, unlike democracy, did not pretend to tolerate dissent. It simply crushed it. And yet, when democracy was restored, Socrates did not emerge as a hero. Athens remembered pain more vividly than principle. The democratic restoration was fragile, haunted by fear of relapse. Amnesty was declared to prevent cycles of revenge, but resentment simmered beneath the surface. The city wanted unity, stability, reassurance. It wanted citizens who affirmed its values, not tested them. Socrates tested them relentlessly. Worse still, his former associates now looked like omens. Critias, one of the 30 tyrants, had been among his companions. Alcibiades, whose brilliance had once dazzled Athens, had betrayed it spectacularly, defecting to Sparta and later Persia. Though Socrates had never endorsed their actions, his proximity to them became guilt by association. History, in its cruelty, rarely separates influence from responsibility. The city began to draw lines. Democracy needed defenders. Tyranny needed enemies. Socrates fit neither category cleanly. He refused to praise democracy simply because it was democratic. He refused to condemn it simply because it failed. He measured systems by virtue, not by loyalty. That neutrality was intolerable. Athens wanted affirmation, not examination. It wanted citizens who would speak in unison, not pause to ask whether the melody was just. In times of peace, Socrates' questions felt stimulating. In times of trauma, they felt destabilizing. The city's tolerance narrowed. Religion, too, hardened. Public rituals took on renewed importance, not as acts of faith, but as demonstrations of unity. The gods had to be appeased. Deviance, even intellectual, felt risky. Socrates' talk of a personal divine sign, his daimonion, now sounded less like humility and more like heresy. Private spirituality threatened public order. Fear does not need proof. It needs patterns. And Athens began to see one. A man who questioned authority. A man admired by unstable youth. A man associated, however loosely, with traitors and tyrants. A man who spoke of gods in unconventional ways. In a wounded city, this combination was explosive. The charges that would one day be brought against Socrates did not emerge suddenly. They fermented slowly, fed by rumor, memory, and unease. Every unanswered question from the past acquired new weight. Every uncomfortable conversation took on political significance. Socrates noticed the shift. Friends warned him to be careful, to soften his tone, to choose his questions wisely. Athens, they said, was not what it used to be. The ground was unstable. Old freedoms no longer applied. Socrates listened, and continued exactly as before. He believed that fear was the worst possible foundation for justice, that laws born from panic would always demand scapegoats, that silencing inquiry in the name of unity was the first step toward moral collapse. If Athens had suffered under tyranny, it was not because people asked too many questions, but because too many people had stopped. To retreat now would be a betrayal, not just of philosophy, but of the city itself. This was the tragedy unfolding in slow motion. Athens believed it needed protection from doubt. Socrates believed Athens needed more of it. Each believed the other was dangerous. And so the distance widened. Public patience thinned. Private conversations turned sharp. The city no longer laughed when powerful men faltered under questioning. It winced. It saw weakness where it once saw irony. It heard threat where it once heard curiosity. Athens had survived war, plague, and tyranny. What it feared now was something quieter. The possibility that its greatest enemy was not Sparta, not oligarchy, not even defeat, but the uncomfortable truth that it might not know itself at all. And in that fear, the fate of Socrates began to feel not tragic, but necessary. Because when a city is unsure of its foundations, the man who keeps tapping the stone is rarely forgiven. They did not arrive together. They did not need to. By the time formal accusations were spoken aloud, the city had already rehearsed them in whispers for years. Names had been exchanged quietly in doorways. Motives had been tested in conversation. The mood had ripened. When the moment came, the charges did not shock Athens. They clarified what many had already decided to believe. 3 men stepped forward to give voice to the city's unease. Meletus was the first to speak, though he would not be the one remembered. He was young, intense, sharp-edged in his convictions. A poet by trade, though not a celebrated one, he claimed to speak for the injured conscience of the city. His accusation was simple and devastating. Socrates did not believe in the gods of Athens. He introduced new spiritual beings. He corrupted the youth. In another time, such charges might have sounded absurd. Socrates participated in public rituals. He sacrificed. He spoke often of divine obligation. But Athens no longer evaluated faith by action alone. Orthodoxy had become a measure of loyalty. To speak of the divine differently, to personalize it, to interpret it, was to risk being labeled dangerous. Meletus did not stand alone for long. Anytus joined him, and with Anytus came weight. He was powerful, wealthy, deeply invested in the restored democracy. His family had suffered under the 30 tyrants. He had fought for the city's rebirth and feared anything that might destabilize it again. Where Meletus brought accusation, Anytus brought legitimacy. He had reason to resent Socrates. Socrates had criticized the notion that political success required virtue. He had questioned whether men chosen by popular vote were necessarily qualified to govern. He had suggested, dangerously, that expertise mattered more than popularity. To Anytus, these ideas smelled of oligarchy, even tyranny. After everything Athens had endured, such skepticism felt like betrayal. The final accuser was Lycon, representing the orators, the professional speakers whose influence Socrates had so often undermined. His presence signaled that this was not merely a religious or political trial. It was a cultural one. Socrates had attacked the prestige of rhetoric itself, exposing how eloquence could mask ignorance. The men whose power rested on words had watched him too long. Together, the three formed an alliance of resentment, not a conspiracy in the dark, but something more unsettling, a convergence. Each man believed himself justified. Each believed he was defending Athens. And in that belief, they found common ground. The charges were framed carefully. Impiety, corruption of youth. They were broad enough to absorb fear, specific enough to sound lawful. They did not accuse Socrates of treason or sedition. That would have required proof. Instead, they accused him of something more elusive, undermining the moral fabric of the city. A crime that could be felt even when it could not be demonstrated. This was deliberate. Athens prided itself on law, but it also understood theatre. Trials were performances. Juries were audiences. Persuasion mattered. And the story the accusers told was compelling. A city wounded by war and betrayal, endangered by a man who questioned its gods, mocked its leaders, and seduced its youth with cleverness. Socrates, they argued, was not merely wrong. He was harmful. What made the accusations effective was that they echoed private grievances. Fathers who felt embarrassed by their sons' questions. Politicians who had been publicly unmasked. Poets whose authority had been quietly stripped away. The trial offered something rare, a chance to transform personal humiliation into public justice. Socrates understood this the moment the charges were read. He did not panic. He did not bargain. But he did recognize the danger. This was not a misunderstanding to be clarified. It was a reckoning. The city was not asking whether he had done wrong. It was asking whether it could continue to tolerate him. And tolerance, once questioned, rarely survives the vote. Friends urged him to prepare a defense that would appease, to show humility, to distance himself from controversial ideas, to call respected citizens as witnesses, to weep, if necessary. Athens expected remorse. It rewarded contrition. Socrates refused, not because he underestimated the risk, but because he understood the cost. To defend himself by denying his life's work would be to admit that the city was right to fear inquiry, that silence was safer than honesty, that virtue could be negotiated. He would not grant them that victory. The accusers, sensing this, sharpened their rhetoric. Meletus portrayed Socrates as a cunning atheist masquerading as a believer. Anytus warned that unchecked skepticism led inevitably to moral decay. Lycon painted him as an enemy of education, poisoning young minds against tradition. Each accusation leaned not on evidence, but on atmosphere. And the atmosphere was heavy. Athens had seen what happened when loyalty fractured. It had lived through betrayal, occupation, and terror. The city was done with experiments. It wanted certainty, stability, reassurance. Socrates offered none of these. In quieter moments, some citizens hesitated. They remembered conversations that had ended not in anger but insight. They remembered Socrates' courage in battle, his refusal to obey unjust orders, his visible integrity. But doubt is fragile in crowds. It dissolves when surrounded by conviction. The accusers did not need unanimity. They needed enough. As the trial date approached, the city leaned in. This was more than a legal proceeding. It was a test of Athens itself. Could a democracy survive a man who questioned its foundations? Or had it already decided that survival required silence? Socrates walked the streets as he always had. He did not flee. He did not hide. He spoke with those willing to listen, asked questions where questions arose, lived as though nothing had changed. To many, this looked like arrogance. To others, resignation. In truth, it was something else entirely. Socrates believed that the measure of a life was not its length, but its alignment with truth. If Athens wished to judge him, it would do so on its terms. He would meet the judgment on his own. The accusers thought they were putting a man on trial. They did not yet realize they were putting an idea on trial instead. The idea that truth could be pursued openly, even when it unsettled the very city that claimed to cherish it. And once that trial began, there would be no verdict that did not change Athens forever. The courtroom was full long before Socrates arrived. Not with anticipation, but with certainty. Athenian trials were not hushed affairs. They were civic spectacles held in the open air, decided by hundreds of jurors drawn from the citizenry. There were no lawyers in the modern sense, no judges to guide proceedings. Each side spoke for itself. Persuasion was everything. Emotion was evidence. The verdict emerged not from deliberation, but from the accumulation of impressions. When Socrates entered, he did not look like a man fighting for his life. He was calm, almost curious, as if stepping into another conversation rather than a confrontation that could end in death. He did not dress to impress. He did not bring his family forward to evoke pity. He did not rehearse the gestures of a man begging to be spared. This alone unsettled the crowd. Athens expected a performance. Socrates refused to perform. The accusers spoke first. Their arguments were polished, familiar, tuned to the anxieties of the city. They reminded the jurors of Socrates' reputation, his influence on youth, his unconventional talk of the divine. They painted a picture of a man who destabilized reverence and encouraged disobedience, not by shouting, but by smiling. It was an effective portrait. It fit what many already believed. When Socrates stood to respond, he did something extraordinary. He did not attack his accusers. He did not dismantle their arguments point by point. Instead, he addressed the jury as if they were interlocutors in one of his conversations. He asked them to listen, not for persuasion, but for truth. This was his first miscalculation, or his first act of defiance. He warned them that he would speak plainly, not in the refined language of the courts, that he would not manipulate their emotions, that he would say what he believed to be true, regardless of the outcome. In another context, this might have been admired. Here, it sounded like indifference. Then, he did the unthinkable. He questioned Meletus. In front of the jury, Socrates turned the elenchus on his accuser. He asked whether it was possible for a man to corrupt youth, intentionally, knowing that corrupted citizens would harm him in return. If corruption was unintentional, why prosecute rather than instruct? If Socrates believed in spiritual beings, how could he be an atheist? The contradictions surfaced quickly, and Meletus faltered. For a moment, the old laughter flickered. But this was not the agora. It was a courtroom, and humiliation here was dangerous. Socrates had proven something, but not what he intended. He had shown that even in the face of death, he He would not abandon his method. He would not soften, would not flatter, would not submit to the expectations of power. To some jurors, this looked like integrity. To others, it looked like contempt. The deeper problem was not the logic of his defense. It was its tone. Athens was not deciding whether Socrates was guilty of impiety in some abstract sense. It was deciding whether it could live with him. The trial was a referendum on his presence, and presence, unlike argument, is judged emotionally. Socrates spoke of his divine mission again, of the oracle, of his duty to question, of his role as a gadfly, sent to stir a sluggish horse. He did not frame this as a justification. He framed it as a fact. The city, he implied, needed him. This did not land as intended. A wounded democracy does not want to be told it requires irritation. It wants affirmation. To compare oneself to a necessary irritant, especially before a jury deciding one's fate, was bold to the point of recklessness. Still, there were jurors who hesitated. They listened as Socrates spoke of virtue, of the soul, of the danger of caring more for wealth and reputation than for moral integrity. He reminded them that death was not the greatest harm a man could suffer, that injustice was, that a good man could not be harmed in life or death, only tested. These words were sincere. They were also terrifying. If taken seriously, they undermined the ultimate power of the court. What authority does a death sentence have over a man who does not fear death? What leverage remains? As the speeches ended, the jurors prepared to vote. The result was closer than many expected. By a narrow margin, Socrates was found guilty, not overwhelmingly, not triumphantly, but decisively enough to proceed. The city had spoken, but not with one voice. Athens was divided, and it knew it. Now came the moment that would define everything. Under Athenian law, a convicted man could propose his own punishment. The accusers had already demanded death. Socrates was expected to counter with exile or a heavy fine. This was the moment for humility, for concession, for survival. The room waited. Socrates stood. He did not plead for exile. He did not offer a fine. At first, he did not express remorse. Instead, he spoke with a calm that bordered on irony. What punishment, he asked, was appropriate for a man who had spent his life trying to improve the city? Then he answered his own question. Free meals for life at the Prytaneum, the honor reserved for Olympic champions and civic heroes. The silence was immediate and absolute. This was not misunderstood humor. It was provocation. A mirror held too close. Socrates was not mocking the court. He was exposing the absurdity of a system that punished moral inquiry while rewarding spectacle. But the jury did not experience it as philosophy. They experienced it as insult. Only then did Socrates offer a fine. Small, almost symbolic, later increased reluctantly at the urging of friends. The damage was done. What might have been a sentence of exile hardened into something final. When the jurors voted again, the margin widened. The sentence was death. In that moment, the trial ended, but the judgment did not. Some jurors felt relief. Others felt unease. A few felt something close to regret, but no one felt victory. The atmosphere was heavy, unresolved. Athens had removed a problem, but at a cost it could not yet calculate. Socrates accepted the sentence without flinching. He did not curse the city. He did not beg the jurors to reconsider. He spoke calmly, almost gently, predicting that killing him would not end criticism, but multiply it. That others would rise to ask the questions he had asked, and the city would be poorer for having silenced him. Then he was led away. The trial had not been about guilt in the legal sense. It had been about compatibility, and Athens had decided that it could no longer coexist with the man who refused to let it believe it already knew enough. The courtroom emptied, but the questions Socrates had posed, about virtue, about authority, about the soul, followed every juror home, and none of them could vote it away. The verdict settled over the city like dust after a collapse. Everything looked the same. Nothing was. Socrates had been condemned, but not yet killed. A sacred mission to Delos delayed executions, buying time no one had asked for. Days passed, then weeks. The city resumed its routines, but the sentence lingered, unfinished, unresolved. Athens had decided to silence a man, yet now had to live with the silence before it arrived. In the prison, Socrates waited, not in despair, not in chains of regret. He waited as he had lived, speaking, questioning, examining. Friends came and went, bringing news, arguments, plans. The most urgent of these plans was escape. It was practical. It was possible. It was already arranged. And to everyone's shock, Socrates refused. This was the moment that bewildered even those who loved him most. He had been sentenced unjustly, they argued. The city had erred. Surely he owed Athens no obedience now. Surely preserving his life, to continue teaching, questioning, guiding, was the greater good. Socrates listened patiently. Then he asked a question. If laws are unjust when they harm us, are they just only when they favor us? The room fell quiet. This was not stubbornness, it was consistency. Socrates believed that justice was not a transaction, but a principle. One did not obey the law because it was convenient, nor disobey it because it was painful. One examined it, and if one had lived under it, benefited from it, participated in it, one could not simply abandon it when it demanded sacrifice. To escape, he argued, would be to harm the laws themselves, to teach that agreements matter only when they are comfortable. That would corrupt the city far more deeply than any question he had ever asked. This reasoning terrified his friends. They saw death approaching and heard only philosophy. But Socrates was not discussing abstraction. He was deciding what kind of man he would be at the end. To flee would be to contradict everything he had taught about integrity, responsibility, and the soul. Better to suffer injustice, he believed, than to commit it. This belief was not dramatic. It was quiet. It did not glorify death. It simply refused to compromise truth for survival. Socrates did not think dying made him virtuous. He thought living falsely would make him unjust. Outside the prison, Athens debated. Some felt unease, even shame. The narrowness of the initial verdict now seemed ominous. Others hardened, insisting the sentence was necessary. A city could not function, they argued, if men were allowed to undermine its values. Mercy, in this view, was weakness. Yet even among those who supported the verdict, a strange tension remained. Socrates did not behave like a defeated man. He did not plead. He did not curse. He did not fade. His calm was unnerving. In conversation, he turned again to the question that had followed him all his life. What is a good life? Is it measured by duration or by alignment with virtue? By comfort or by coherence? By survival or by honesty? These questions were no longer theoretical. They were embodied. Every day Socrates lived under sentence sharpened them. The delay made everything worse. Athens had expected closure. Instead, it was forced to watch a man embody the consequences of its decision. His composure suggested that death was not the punishment the city believed it to be. That possibility threatened the authority of the verdict itself. Power depends on fear. Socrates had removed fear from the equation. When the sacred ship returned, the end could no longer be postponed. The order was given. The poison would be prepared. Socrates' friends gathered one last time. They did not speak as mourners. They spoke as students, as companions in inquiry. The conversation turned, as it always had, to the soul. Socrates argued that death was either a dreamless sleep or a journey to another place where true wisdom might finally be found. In either case, it was not to be feared. This was not comfort offered to others. It was clarity offered to himself. As the moment approached, emotions broke through. Tears came. Hands trembled. The calm that Socrates had maintained wavered only once, when he gently asked his friends to restrain their grief. Not because it was wrong, but because it distracted from the moment's meaning. This was not an ending to be rushed. The question that had followed him his entire life now stood fully revealed, not as a sentence spoken aloud, but as a challenge embodied in action. Is a life without integrity worth preserving? Is obedience to conscience more important than obedience to law? Is truth something to be spoken only when it is safe? Athens had answered these questions one way. Socrates answered them another, and in that divergence lay the true reason for his death. The poison waited. So did history. Because when Socrates lifted the cup, he was not accepting defeat. He was asking one final question, not of the court, not of the city, but of anyone who would remember him. What are you willing to die for? And more dangerously still, what are you willing to live without? The cup was already mixed, but time had not yet lost its shape. Socrates sat on the low stone bench of the prison cell, the light slanting through the bars in a way that made the dust seem almost deliberate, as if even the air had paused to watch. His friends gathered around him in uneven silence. Men who had argued with him, laughed with him, followed him through the streets of Athens for years. They had come prepared for an ending. They were not prepared for his composure. The jailer entered quietly. He was not cruel. In fact, he seemed embarrassed by the role he was about to play. This, too, unsettled everyone. Execution was meant to be brutal or distant, something that could be blamed on systems or gods. But here it arrived in human form, apologetic, procedural, unavoidable. Socrates thanked him, not out of habit, out of conviction. Courtesy, Socrates believed, was not suspended by injustice. To abandon virtue in the face of death would be to surrender it precisely when it mattered most. The jailer explained what would happen. The poison, hemlock, would numb the limbs, creeping upward until it reached the heart. There would be no pain, only heaviness. When the cold reached his chest, it would be over. Socrates listened carefully, asked one or two clarifying questions, and nodded. Even now, inquiry had not left him. As the jailer withdrew, the conversation resumed. It was not about escape. That question had already been answered. It was not about fear. That emotion had lost its grip. It was about meaning. What it meant to die well, to live rightly until the final breath. One of his companions asked whether the soul survived death. Socrates did not pretend certainty. He offered possibilities, not dogma. Perhaps the soul traveled to another realm where true justice prevailed. Perhaps death was a dreamless sleep, a release from consciousness. In either case, he argued, a good man had nothing to fear. The terror lay not in death, but in living unjustly. This was the difference that had always separated him from his city. Athens feared chaos. Socrates feared moral incoherence. As emotions surfaced, Socrates gently redirected them. Grief, he said, was natural, but despair was unnecessary. They were not witnessing a tragedy in the way the city understood it. They were witnessing consistency. A life lived according to principle rarely ends dramatically. It ends honestly. At one point, someone began to weep openly. Socrates smiled, not dismissively, but with tenderness. He reminded them that they had come to witness not a loss, but a completion. That philosophy, practiced seriously, prepared one for this moment, not by promising survival, but by clarifying what survival was worth. Then the cup was brought in. The liquid was pale, unremarkable. No thunder, no ceremony. The most consequential act of Athenian justice arrived without spectacle. This, too, was fitting. Socrates had spent his life resisting performance. His death would be no different. He took the cup calmly. Before drinking, he asked if a small amount could be poured out as a libation to the gods. The jailer explained gently that the dose had to be exact. Socrates accepted this without complaint. The gods, he believed, did not require gestures, only integrity. He drank. Not quickly, not slowly. Simply as one would drink anything placed in one's hand. The room held its breath. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, Socrates set the cup down and began to walk, as instructed, to help the poison circulate. He spoke casually, even lightly, remarking on the strangeness of discussing immortality while feeling one's legs grow heavy. Soon, the numbness arrived. He lay back on the bench as his feet began to chill. The jailer checked him, methodical and gentle. The cold crept upward. Socrates described the sensation without drama, as if reporting an experiment's result. When the numbness reached his abdomen, he fell silent for a moment. Then he spoke again. His final words were not about Athens, not about injustice, not about regret. They were about obligation. He reminded his friends that he owed a rooster to Asclepius, the god of healing. A strange thing to say at the edge of death, but to Socrates it made perfect sense. Death, he believed, was a kind of cure, a release from the long illness of embodied uncertainty. Do not neglect it, he said. Pay the debt. Then the numbness reached his chest. The jailer pressed his foot. There was no response. He pressed higher. Nothing. When he reached the heart, he paused. Socrates was gone. No cry marked the moment. No divine sign. No final protest. Just silence. The men in the room wept openly now. The weight of what they had witnessed finally broke through. They had not merely lost a friend. They had witnessed the rarest thing in human history. A life and death aligned so precisely that no contradiction remained. Outside, Athens continued. Markets opened. Debates resumed. Children played. The city had executed a man and moved on, as cities always do. But something had shifted, because Socrates did not die like a criminal. He did not die like a martyr. He died like a question that refused to collapse into an answer. And that question, about justice, about truth, about the soul, had now been released from the body that once carried it. It was free. And Athens, whether it knew it or not, would never stop answering for what it had done. Even now, the silence did not end when Socrates stopped breathing. It expanded. Athens had executed a man, but it had not buried the question that brought him there. If anything, that question had slipped its boundaries, seeping into the spaces he once occupied. The agora, the gymnasiums, the quiet corners where conversations used to stall under his gaze. Absence, it turned out, could be louder than presence. The body was removed. The prison returned to routine. The city told itself that order had been restored, but order built on unresolved doubt never holds for long. Those who had condemned Socrates expected relief. Instead, many felt an unease they could not name. The trial had ended, yet something felt unfinished, as if the verdict had closed a door that should have remained open. Some jurors avoided speaking of it. Others defended their decision with increasing insistence. When justification grows louder, it is often because certainty has begun to erode. The first echoes appeared in whispers. Had the city acted wisely? Had it confused irritation with danger? Had it silenced a critic when what it needed was correction? These questions were not asked publicly at first. They were exchanged quietly, between friends, in moments of candor. Athens had killed a man for speaking too freely. That fact, once acknowledged, was difficult to contain. Then the students began to speak. Plato, young and shaken, had watched the trial and the execution with a clarity that would never leave him. He did not shout. He did not protest. He did something far more enduring. He wrote, not transcripts, but reconstructions. Not arguments, but conversations. He preserved Socrates not as a martyr, but as a voice, probing, patient, relentless. Through Plato, Socrates returned, not as a citizen, but as a presence that could not be tried as or sentenced. In dialogues that unfolded like living thought, Socrates questioned generals, poets, sophists, even death itself. He asked what justice was, what courage demanded, what knowledge meant. And because these works travelled beyond Athens, the city lost control of the narrative. The man it had silenced became universal. Others followed. Xenophon recorded memories, more practical, more restrained. Later thinkers built systems from fragments of Socratic inquiry. Aristotle, generations later, would still be answering him. Philosophy itself reorganized around the absence Socrates left behind. Athens, meanwhile, learned an uncomfortable lesson. Democracy survived. It always does, but it carried a scar. The execution of Socrates became a reference point, a moment when the city confronted the limits of its tolerance. It had claimed to value free inquiry, yet punished it when inquiry became inconvenient. That contradiction would haunt political thought for centuries. What Athens feared most, that Socrates would undermine authority, came true in a way it never anticipated, not through rebellion, not through chaos, but through influence that no verdict could restrain. Because Socrates had not taught doctrines, he had taught a way of thinking. And ways of thinking do not die with their originators. The question that killed him was never written down as a single sentence. It lived between his words, in the pauses he allowed, in the discomfort he refused to resolve. It was the question beneath all others. What do you think you know, and why? That question unsettles every system built on assumed wisdom. It threatens every authority that relies on reverence rather than reason. It exposes the difference between tradition and truth. And once asked seriously, it cannot be unanswered. This is why Socrates still matters. Not because he was right about everything. He would have rejected that claim himself. But because he insisted that certainty without examination was dangerous, that living well required ongoing inquiry, that obedience without understanding was a form of moral sleep. The final irony is this: Athens killed Socrates to protect itself from instability. Yet by doing so, it created one of the most destabilizing ideas in human history: the idea that no belief is above questioning, not even those held by the majority. Every time someone challenges a popular opinion, every time authority is asked to justify itself, every time a student asks a teacher why and refuses an easy answer, Socrates speaks again. His death did not end a conversation. It ensured that the conversation would never end. The cup of poison was lifted once. The question he embodied is lifted every day, and now it reaches you, not as a demand, but as an invitation to examine what you believe, to notice where certainty has replaced understanding, to ask whether comfort has silenced curiosity. Because the question that killed Socrates still walks among us, quiet, persistent, patient. And it does not ask whether you are ready. It only asks whether you are willing to answer it honestly.